In this episode, we will look into the normal ECG waveform generated by various leads. Once we understand the logic and connection between heart's current directions and the way ECG leads view it from respective angles, we will have better understanding of ECG graph. Let's get into it. This is an ECG of a young female brought in for elective surgery. After we have discussed the ECG waveforms, we will return to this same ECG at the end of this episode and see how much we have gained. To start understanding the graphs, let's first understand the ECG grid lines. As you can see, the ECG grid lines move as a function of time horizontally and voltage shown by vertical amplitude. The grid lines are of two types, the thick lines and the thinner ones. The thick lines help us differentiate large boxes and the thin lines identify small boxes. Horizontally along x-axis, a 1 second strip is completed by 5 large boxes. Vertically, one large box is 0.5 millivolts of voltage deflection. So 2 large boxes register 1 millivolt of voltage change vertically as a deflection. Let's take one large box out and see what's inside. Every large box has 5 small boxes. One large box is 0.2 seconds, so 5 large boxes make 1 second. Every large box is 5 mm, so this makes 25 mm of horizontal distance every second. This is why the standard speed set on ECG machine is 25 millimeters per second. Let's further zoom in and see what the small box constitutes. Each small box is 1 millimeter in size. Horizontally, one small box is 0.04 seconds and vertically it is 0.1 millivolts. From episode 1 of this chapter, we studied how various limbs and chest leads are oriented around the frontal and transverse axis of heart. The pink leads of lead 1, 2 and 3, purple for augmented leads, AVL, AVF and AVR making frontal axis. The red colored chest leads from V1 to V6 in transverse axis to heart. From previous episode, we know how the deflection of ECG is registered based on direction of ECG lead direction and the red intrinsic current of heart. If both are in the same direction, it is positive deflection. If perpendicular, it is biphasic. If opposing, it makes a negative deflection. In other words, if we take lead 2 in this frontal plane, the current moving towards lead 2 will generate a positive deflection. The current away and opposite to lead 2 will cause negative deflection. Now, as we move on, we will see the location, amplitude, duration, and also see deflection patterns of respective waveforms in 12 lead system for a normal ECG waveform. On the right side of the page, you are seeing a 12 lead ECG containing 3 limb leads 1, 2 and 3, 3 augmented leads AVR, AVL and AVF, and 6 chest leads from V1 to V6. Let's begin how waveform is formed. The cardiac cycle starts with blue colored depolarization wave coming from the SA node that moves downwards towards AV node and also moves from right atrium to left atrium. This wave is in parallel to lead 2 moving towards lead 2, so waveform is positive deflection of 2 to 3 millimeters vertically called the P wave. The first half is due to right atrial currents moving down to AV node, while the second half is due to current shifting to left side. Its duration is 0.06 to 0.12 seconds, which is roughly 2 to 3 small boxes. So how do ECG leads other than lead 2 read it? We just said that the depolarization from SA node not just goes downwards towards AV node, it moves from right atrium to the left atrium as well. So where lead 2 registers it as a positive deflection, other left oriented leads will follow similar pattern. But things are different for right sided leads, namely AVR and chest lead V1. For V1, the initial rise of P wave is due to downward atrial current in right atrium. This is followed by a negative deflection because of current moving towards left atrium, which is moving away from V1. This can produce a biphasic waveform, which is considered normal. As for AVR, The atrial currents moving downwards and to the left atrium are both in opposite direction, so a negative P wave is normal in AVR. After P wave comes the AV nodal delay seen on ECG as PR interval. PR interval duration is 0.12 to 0.2 seconds. In other words, roughly 3 to 5 small boxes. We will gradually come to discussing pathological side of each segment in future episodes. Like prolonged PR interval may signify AV blocks and shortened PR interval may point towards pre-excitation syndromes. This will be touched in subsequent episodes. Coming up next is the QRS complex, which is very important segment signifying the ventricular depolarization. Let's get into knowing QRS complex better. The duration of QRS complex is less than 0.12 seconds. Short QRS means depolarization has undergone usual normal bundle of phase and Purkinje fiber system for quick depolarization, hence the shortened time. Prolonged duration or broad QRS signifies conduction anomaly, meaning the origin of depolarization may not have followed the usual path of depolarization. This means ectopic sites of origin and slower ventricular muscle conduction without dedicated fast conduction pathway. Some salient points to remember regarding QRS complex. Number 1. The Q wave is always first one and deflecting downwards. If the first deflection is positive, it is called the R wave, not Q wave. In such instance, the QRS complex doesn't have Q wave. Number 2. The first positive is called R. The second positive deflection, if present, is called the R prime. Number 3. Small deflection is labeled with small r, large deflection is labeled with capital R. For example, waveform 1 has no initial negative deflection, so there is no Q wave in the complex. Instead, there is a big positive deflection. This will be marked capital R. In wave 2, there is huge positive deflection called capital R, followed by small negative deflection called the small s. Third wave begins with small r followed by a huge negative deflection labeled as capital S. In the fourth wave, it begins with the negative deflection, so it is called the small q, followed by capital R and capital S. To understand QRS complex, we will take two leads from the limb, one left-sided lead, lead 2, and the other right-sided, AVR. The ventricular depolarization is categorized into three key parts. The first part begins with interventricular septum, marked in yellow. Since the septum is supplied by Purkinje fibers from the left bundle branch, the depolarization is directed from left to right in the septum. These small currents going against lead 2 are registered as a small Q wave on lead 2. As for lead AVR, the current in septum moving rightwards are in same plane as AVR, hence the positive deflection called the small r. Next, depolarization wave spreads downwards through the septum and distributes to the left and right. Since the left ventricle has many times more mass than right ventricle, the principal current dominating on ECG is of left ventricle, unless there is right ventricular hypertrophy. Therefore, the main depolarization wave registered by ECG leads in ventricles is large and amplitude travels downwards and leftwards. This would cause a huge deflection on left-sided leads like lead 2, moving away from right-sided AVR, thus causing huge downward deflection or capital S on lead AVR. The third part of ventricular depolarization wave is one from basal parts of the heart, which is directed upwards and backwards. This causes negative small s wave on lead 2. Let's see how the chest leads interpret the three ventricular depolarization events. The first yellow colored interseptal current wave moving rightwards would move towards V1, but away from V4 and V6, therefore causing a small positive R on V1 and a small negative Q on V4 and V6. The second part, meaning the main left ventricular mass depolarization, would be moving away from V1, causing a giant S or negative deflection on V1. As for V4, the wave would fall somewhere in perpendicular to the lead location, leading to a biphasic response. But it would become positive waveform in V5 and V6, which are located to the leftmost part of chest leads. So this is how the R wave progresses through the chest leads in normal situation. It starts as negative deflection on V1 and becomes biphasic until it becomes fully positive deflection on V6. So the crux is that a negative QRS deflection is normal in right-sided leads, namely AVR and V1. P wave is negative in AVR, it can be biphasic in V1, V2. The point of conclusion of QRS complex marks the J point. This is where the ST segment begins. The significance of J point is if it is deflection 2 mm above isoelectric line, it can indicate ST segment elevation, in other words ST elevation MI. After the J point comes the ST segment, which extends from S to T. The maroon colored T wave marks the repolarization wave across the ventricles. Its amplitude is variable depending upon the leads being seen. So this is how a normal ECG waveform spreads across lead 2 against time. We have seen the PR interval, the QRS complex, the ST segment. Last but not the least is the QT interval, beginning from Q till the end of T. This interval represents the time of ventricular depolarization and repolarization. Its normal variation should be less than 0.44 seconds or less than half the distance between successive RR waves. This time equals almost 11 small boxes, where each small box is 0.04 seconds. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 small boxes. Finally, let's discuss the heart's normal frontal axis and how to see it on ECG to diagnose abnormality. We have seen how frontal axis of heart is covered by limb ECG leads from 0 degrees to 180 degrees to negative 90 and back to 0. The normal axis of heart vector or current is between minus 30 degrees to 0 degrees. We said during QRS depolarization how the main depolarizing wave moves downwards and leftwards due to left ventricular mass size. In order to see this axis through QRS, we take two leads only, which are present at right angle to each other. The lead 1 is horizontal lead at 0 degrees, while lead AVF is moving downwards at 90 degrees. So how would R wave register on these two leads in normal axis? The red arrow indicates the depolarization wave direction. In normal case, it can be anywhere between minus 30 degrees to plus 90 degrees. This would be within the plane range of both lead 1 and AVF, thus generating a positive deflection in both leads. But if the red arrow moves leftwards and upwards beyond minus 30 degrees, it would still be in the range of lead 1, thus lead 1 would have positive deflection. But for AVF, the red arrow is in opposite direction moving away, so negative deflection on AVF. This is diagnosed as left axis deviation, highlighted in orange, between minus 30 to minus 90 degrees. Let's see this on a 12 lead ECG. In this ECG, you can see positive going lead 1, but in lead AVF, the QRS complex is downgoing. So, a left axis deviation. In normal ECG, both the leads will have upgoing deflection. Left axis deviation can be normal variant or due to any disease causing left ventricular hypertrophy or displacement such as mediastinal shifts. Now we have discussed this earlier that ECG leads register the left ventricular depolarization above right ventricular vector currents because of huge size and wave amplitude generated in left ventricle compared to right ventricle. But what if any disease leads to right ventricular enlargement? In such instances, the dominant vector would be right ventricle depolarization wave, right? The depolarization wave would still be in range of AVF, generating positive deflection, but markedly away and opposing the left-sided leads, thus a negative deflection in lead 1, highlighting right axis in blue between plus 90 degrees to plus 180 degrees. So let's see axis deviation on this ECG, taking the two leads, lead 1 and lead AVF. There is negative deflection on lead 1, meaning vector is opposing direction of lead 1, and there is positive deflection on AVF. So a right axis deviation. So as said before, any condition such as COPD, pulmonary hypertension causing right ventricular hypertrophy would cause a right axis deviation. So in this way, calculating the axis deviation on ECG helps in giving vital information to reach a diagnosis. At conclusion, coming back to the 12-lead ECG shown in the beginning of this video, we have seen the P wave, QRS complex, T wave. The PR interval here is almost 3 small boxes, so around 0.12 seconds, which is in normal range. The QRS complex is barely 2 dots wide, meaning it is narrow QRS, meaning the depolarization wave followed usual normal conduction pathway. The blue highlighted P wave is negative in AVR, which is normal. It is biphasic in V1 and positive in the left-sided leads. The QRS complex is negative in AVR as main green depolarization current is moving against the AVR purple directed lead. In the chest leads, QRS is negative in V1 and gradually starts becoming biphasic until in extremely left V5 and V6 it is positive. V5 carries usually the maximum positive amplitude of QRS as it is located ideally in line with the depolarization wave direction. As for the axis of heart in this 12-lead ECG, we take lead 1 and lead AVF. Since the deflection is positive in both leads, so we declare the heart to be in normal axis range between minus 30 to plus 90 degrees. This is all for today. Now that we have covered the ECG waveform and axis system on 12-lead ECG, in the next episode, we will talk about how to systematically interpret ECG and reach diagnosis. Thank you and stay tuned.